I pulled into the employee parking lot at the Yellowstone Ranger Station, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. 7 years of urban police work hadn't prepared me for this kind of quiet. No sirens, no traffic, no constant buzz of city life, just the soft crunch of gravel under my tires and the distant sound of wind through pine trees. The transition felt surreal. 3 months ago, I'd been chasing down suspects through Denver alleyways and dealing with domestic disturbances in cramped apartments. Now I was trading my badge for a different kind of uniform, swapping concrete for wilderness, crime scenes for campgrounds. The change had been my choice, but sitting here in the shadow of the mountains, I wondered if I'd made the right call. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and headed toward the station. The building looked exactly like I'd expected. Rustic wood construction, green roof, that official National Park Service feel that managed to be both welcoming and authoritative. A few other rangers moved around the parking area, checking equipment and loading supplies into trucks. They nodded politely as I passed, but nobody stopped to introduce themselves. Fair enough. First day on the job, I figured I'd have plenty of time to learn names and faces. Inside, the station was busy with the kind of organized activity I recognized from precinct houses. Rangers grouped around bulletin boards, checking schedules and discussing patrol routes. Radio chatter filled the background. Status updates, weather reports, campsite conditions. The familiarity of it relaxed me a little. Different setting, same basic structure. "You must be Thompson." A man in his late 40s approached, clipboard in hand. His uniform looked worn in all the right places, the kind of comfortable fit that came from years of field work. "David Wilson, your supervisor. Welcome to Yellowstone." "Mike Thompson. Good to meet you." "Ready to get started? I've got your locker assignment and patrol schedule. We'll run through the basics today, get you oriented with the area." He gestured toward a bank of metal lockers along the far wall. "Number 37 is yours. Combinations written on the card there." I followed him over, noting how the other rangers seemed to give us space without making it obvious. New guy treatment, probably. I'd been through it before in different jobs. David handed me a small index card with the combination and walked me through the standard equipment checklist: radio, first aid kit, flashlight, emergency flares, the usual ranger gear. "Uniform shirts are in there, along with some department manuals and safety protocols," he said, already glancing at his clipboard like he had a dozen other things to handle. "Take your time getting settled. Your first patrol starts at 7 tonight. We'll have you doing evening rounds near Old Faithful to get a feel for visitor interactions." He moved off to deal with another ranger's question, leaving me alone with my new locker. I spun the combination lock and pulled the door open, expecting to find exactly what he described. The uniforms hung neatly on hooks, and a stack of manuals sat on the upper shelf. But taped to the inside of the locker door was a piece of paper I definitely hadn't expected. Someone had written on it in careful, precise handwriting, the kind of penmanship that looked like every letter had been formed with intention. "Rules for Yellowstone Rangers. Night shift. 1. If you see a pale figure in the woods during your patrol, do not look directly at it. Say, "I'm just here to ensure the safety of campers," and turn your back. Do not run. 2. If the forest goes completely silent, no birds, insects, or wind, stop moving immediately. Do not take another step until normal sounds return. 3. Avoid anyone wearing yellow rain jackets in groups of 4 or more. Make an excuse and leave the area quickly. 4. Never follow the sound of a child crying, no matter how distressed they sound. Stay on marked trails. 5. If someone knocks on your cabin door after 11 p.m., do not answer. Do not look out the windows. Stay in bed until sunrise. These are not suggestions. Your life depends on following them exactly. I stared at the paper for a long moment, reading through the list twice. My first instinct was to laugh. Classic rookie hazing, make the new guy paranoid about mysterious forest creatures and unexplained dangers. Every job had its version of this. The police department had been full of stories designed to mess with fresh recruits, urban legends about haunted patrol routes and cursed evidence lockers. I crumpled the paper and tossed it toward a nearby trash can. But something made me pause. The handwriting bothered me. It wasn't the sloppy scrawl of someone playing a prank. Each word had been written with care, like the person took the message seriously. The paper itself looked like it had been there for a while, the tape edges slightly yellowed. I walked over and picked the crumpled note out of the trash, smoothing it against my thigh. And there was something about the tone, direct, urgent, almost desperate. Who wrote warnings about staying in bed until sunrise as a gag? I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Maybe I was overthinking it, but 7 years of police work had taught me to pay attention when something felt off. Even if this turned out to be an elaborate prank, keeping the rules wouldn't hurt anything. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of orientation materials and equipment checks. David introduced me to other members of the ranger staff, walked me through the radio protocols, and gave me a basic rundown of the park layout. Everyone seemed professional and helpful, though I noticed nobody mentioned the note in my locker. If this was a team effort to mess with the new guy, they were playing it straight. By evening, I felt reasonably confident about handling a basic patrol. The Old Faithful area was one of the most visited parts of the park, which meant plenty of people around and well-marked paths. Good place to start, especially for someone used to urban environments, where backup was never more than a few minutes away. I loaded my gear into one of the park trucks and headed out as the sun started to drop behind the mountains. The geyser basin looked different in the fading light, less touristy, more wild. Visitors were heading back to their accommodations, leaving behind the boardwalks and thermal features that drew millions of people every year. Soon it would just be me, the landscape, and whatever nocturnal wildlife called this place home. The first few hours went smoothly. I checked on a few late campers, made sure the restroom facilities were secure, and got used to the patrol route. The radio stayed quiet except for routine check-ins from other rangers. Nothing unusual, nothing that required the kind of split-second decision-making I'd grown accustomed to in police work. Around 10:30, I was walking a section of trail that wound through a grove of lodgepole pines when I saw it. The figure stood motionless between the trees, maybe 50 yards off the main path. At first, it looked like a person, tall, wearing what might have been light-colored clothing. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the proportions began to seem wrong. Too tall, definitely. And the limbs looked stretched, like someone had taken a normal human body and pulled it upward, until everything became unnaturally long. My training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, determine if this was a lost hiker or something else entirely. I took a step forward, squinting to get a better look, when the figure began to turn in my direction. That's when the rules from my locker came flooding back. If you see a pale figure in the woods during your patrol, do not look directly at it. I jerked my head to the side, focusing on a spot of ground near my feet instead of the thing between the trees. But I forced myself to remember the rest of the instruction. "I'm just here to ensure the safety of campers," I said, loud enough to carry across the distance. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Turn your back. Do not run." Every instinct I had screamed against turning away from a potential threat. Police training had drilled into me the importance of maintaining visual contact, of never presenting your back to an unknown situation. But the memory of that careful handwriting held me in place. Someone had written those rules with absolute conviction, and something about the figure ahead made my skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with rational fear. I turned around slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Behind me, the night felt suddenly heavy. No footsteps, no rustling branches, no sound of movement at all. Just the terrible feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. Minutes passed. I counted them off in my head, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder or break into a run. The rules had been specific about not running, and at this point I was prepared to follow them exactly. Whatever was behind me, running felt like it would trigger something I didn't want to deal with. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt physical, like pressure against the back of my neck. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, focusing on my breathing and my radio. Normal things, real things that made sense. When I finally turned around, the grove was empty. I stood there for several more minutes, looking around the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. Whatever I'd seen was gone, leaving behind only the quiet sounds of a normal forest night. Insects buzzing, branches creaking in the breeze, the distant call of an owl, all perfectly ordinary. I finished my patrol without incident, but the folded piece of paper in my pocket felt important. By the time I returned to the ranger station, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 hours earlier. The rules weren't a prank, and I was going to follow them. I woke up with the memory of those long arms burned into my mind. Sleep had come in pieces, broken up every hour or so by the picture of that thing standing still between the trees. Rolling out of my narrow bunk, I caught myself checking the windows before getting dressed. Nothing there except morning forest and mountains, but the worry stuck around. My second day at Yellowstone started with the same routine briefing at the ranger station. Other rangers moved through their morning preparations with the easy confidence of people who belonged here. I envied that feeling. Coffee helped, but not enough to get rid of the questions spinning in my head. David Wilson stood near the duty board, updating assignments like he always did. I walked over to him during a quiet moment in the morning chaos, when most of the other rangers had headed out for their shifts. "David, I wanted to ask about the ranger who had my position before me." His pen stopped moving across the clipboard. The change was subtle but immediate. His shoulders tensed, and he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Uncomfortable, maybe. Definitely guarded. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, returning his attention to the duty roster. "She quit about 3 weeks ago. Any particular reason?" "Personal decision." He flipped to another page, clearly hoping to end the conversation. "She had excellent performance reviews, never caused any problems, just decided the position wasn't for her anymore." The words came out too practiced, like he'd rehearsed this response. I'd heard that tone plenty of times during police interviews. People trying to give just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. "Did she give notice?" "She submitted her resignation on a Friday afternoon and cleaned out her desk the same day." David's pen clicked against the clipboard in a steady rhythm. Left everything in good order, very professional. 3 weeks. That meant her locker had been sitting empty for almost a month before I arrived. Plenty of time for someone to remove anything personal or sensitive. But apparently not enough time for someone to take down the rules taped inside the door. "I see." I waited to see if he'd volunteer anything else, but David had already moved on to studying weather reports with focused attention. The conversation was over. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing park maps and getting used to radio protocols. Normal ranger work, the kind of preparation that made sense regardless of what might be hiding in the forests after dark. But the image of that pale figure kept interrupting my concentration, and I found myself thinking about Sarah Mitchell's sudden departure. Excellent performance reviews and no explanation. Someone who took pride in her work based on how she'd left everything organized, but who walked away from her job without warning. The timing bothered me too. 3 weeks ago meant she'd quit right around the end of summer season, when rangers would normally be preparing for autumn duties and fewer visitors. My afternoon assignment took me to Lamar Valley, a section of the park known for wildlife viewing and camping. The drive out gave me time to appreciate the landscape in daylight, rolling grasslands surrounded by mountains. The kind of scenery that drew millions of visitors every year. Hard to imagine anything scary in such an openly beautiful place. I found the family of campers I was supposed to check on without any trouble. Standard stuff, making sure they had proper food storage, confirming their camping permits were in order, answering questions about trail conditions. A couple from Minnesota with 2 teenage kids, all of them friendly and well-prepared. The kind of visitors who made the job pleasant. "Are there any dangerous animals we should watch for?" the father asked as I finished reviewing their permit. Bears and wolves, I said automatically. Keep food in the bear boxes, don't approach wildlife, stay on marked trails, standard precautions. The family nodded and thanked me for the information. I was turning to head back to my truck when it happened. The forest went silent. Not gradually, not the way sounds might fade during a normal lull in activity. One moment I could hear birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze. The next moment, complete quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Even the family behind me seemed to fall silent, though I couldn't tell if they'd noticed the change or were simply caught up in the same unnatural hush. My right foot was in the air, mid-step toward the parking area. The second rule flashed through my memory with perfect clarity. If the forest goes completely silent, stop moving immediately. Do not take another step until normal sounds return. I froze, balancing awkwardly with one foot raised, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. Every muscle in my body wanted to complete the step, to move normally, to pretend nothing unusual was happening. But the silence pressed against my ears like physical weight, and something deep in my survival instinct screamed warnings I didn't understand. Behind me, one of the teenagers said something to his parents, but even their voices sounded muffled and wrong, like they were speaking through thick glass. The normal acoustics of the outdoors had vanished completely. Minutes crawled by. My raised leg started to ache, then burn, but I held the position. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt loaded with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. My police training had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, and everything about this situation set off every alarm bell I'd developed over 7 years of urban patrol. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine. The family was definitely talking now, their voices carrying that particular tone people used when they were trying to decide if they should be concerned about something. I wanted to reassure them, to explain that I was just being cautious, but the rules had been specific about not moving. 6 minutes, 7, 8. My legs shook with the effort of maintaining balance, and I started to worry about falling over. But the silence held, thick and oppressive, making the normal world feel impossibly distant. Then, faint and far away, I heard a single bird chirp. The sound was like a crack in a dam. Within seconds, the normal symphony of forest noise came flooding back. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, birds calling to each other across the valley. The oppressive weight lifted from the air, and suddenly I could breathe properly again. I lowered my foot to the ground, trying to make the movement look casual. My leg nearly buckled, but I managed to stay upright. Behind me, the family was discussing whether they'd seen a bear or elk, apparently having missed the acoustic anomaly entirely. "Everything okay, Ranger?" the father called. "Just listening for wildlife," I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "You folks have a good afternoon." I walked back to my truck on wobbly legs, nodding goodbye to the family while my mind went through what had just happened. 10 minutes of complete quiet in the middle of a busy ecosystem. No bears, no predators, no clear reason why every living thing in the area would suddenly stop making noise. Except it wasn't without explanation. Someone had written specific instructions about exactly this situation, and those instructions had just saved me from... what? I had no idea what would have happened if I'd kept walking, but the feeling that it would have been bad settled into my bones. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a blur of questions I couldn't answer. By the time I parked in the employee lot, one thing had become clear. The rules weren't a prank. Sarah Mitchell had left them for a reason, and whatever she'd experienced during her time here had been real enough to make her quit a job she was apparently good at. The station buzzed with typical late afternoon activity. Rangers returning from patrols, updating logs, preparing for evening duty. I moved through the routine check-in procedures automatically, my mind focused on a single goal. I needed to find out more about Sarah Mitchell, and her desk seemed like the logical place to start. The office area held 6 desks arranged in 2 rows, each one equipped with a computer terminal and filing drawers. David pointed out Sarah's old workspace during my first day tour, mentioning it would probably be reassigned soon. Located in the back corner, it had a clear view of the duty board and radio station, but felt somehow cut off from the main flow of activity. I waited until most of the other rangers had finished their paperwork and headed home. David left around 5:30, reminding me to lock up when I finished my reports. By 6 o'clock, I was alone in the station with Sarah's abandoned desk. The surface was clean, no personal items, no scattered papers, nothing to suggest someone had once worked there regularly. But the drawers told a different story. Sarah had been thorough about clearing out obvious personal belongings, but she'd left behind the kind of routine paperwork that built up in any job. Duty rosters from earlier in the summer, equipment checklists, copies of incident reports. I flipped through the incident reports first, expecting to find the usual range of ranger business: lost hikers, wildlife encounters, medical emergencies, traffic violations. Instead, I found something much more interesting. Sarah had been documenting patterns. Not officially, these weren't the kind of reports that would go into permanent files or administrative reviews. These were personal notes, written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen on the rules in my locker. June 15th. Weather problem during patrol near Fishing Bridge. Complete quiet lasting approximately 8 minutes. No visible wildlife activity during event. June 23rd. Campers report strange person seen near thermal features after midnight. Unable to locate source of sighting during follow-up investigation. July 2nd. Radio interference during evening patrol. Voices claiming to be other rangers requesting assistance, but duty roster shows all personnel accounted for at other locations. July 18th. Wildlife behavioral problems seen in Lamar Valley. Elk herd ran away suddenly with no apparent cause. Complete stop of bird activity for 12 minutes. The reports continued through August, becoming more frequent and more detailed. Sarah had been tracking something, multiple incidents involving quiet, strange people, false radio calls, and animals acting scared. She'd noted dates, times, locations, weather conditions. Someone building a case for something she couldn't officially report. The final entry was dated August 29th, 3 days before her resignation. Partner still missing. Official search called off after 72 hours. I know what happened to him, but I can't prove it, and no one would believe me anyway. The rules work. Follow them exactly. Trust nothing that seems wrong, even if it looks known. I read that last entry 3 times, feeling pieces of a puzzle slide into place. Sarah hadn't quit because she didn't like the job. She'd quit because someone she cared about had gone missing, and she knew something about the circumstances that she couldn't share through official channels. The rules weren't just protection. They were a warning based on direct experience. Sarah had figured out how to survive whatever was happening in this park, and she'd left instructions for whoever came after her. I gathered the incident reports and slipped them into my jacket. David might wonder where they'd gone eventually, but Sarah had clearly intended them to be found by the right person. Someone who would take them seriously instead of dismissing them as stress-related paranoia. That evening, alone in my cabin, I spread Sarah's reports across my small table and read through them again. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Incidents clustered around certain areas, specific times when normal rules seemed to break down, entities that could copy human voices and appearances. I pulled the folded rules from my pocket and smoothed them out beside the reports. Every instruction corresponded to something Sarah had documented. The pale person, the unnatural, quiet, false distress calls, things that appeared human but weren't. She'd learned these lessons the hard way, losing someone important in the process. Now she was gone too, but she'd left behind everything I needed to avoid making the same mistakes. I refolded the rules and put them back in my pocket, but this time, they felt different. Not like a prank or curiosity, but like a lifeline. Sarah Mitchell had spent her final weeks at Yellowstone trying to protect whoever would take her place, documenting threats that couldn't be officially acknowledged and creating guidelines that might keep another ranger alive. I had no idea what I was really dealing with, but I knew enough to follow her advice exactly. Tomorrow night, I'd be back on patrol, and when something impossible appeared in my path, I'd be ready for it. I'd spent the last 2 days going through Sarah's incident reports again and again, memorizing dates and locations until the pattern burned itself into my mind. What she'd documented settled over me like a heavy coat, one I couldn't take off now that I understood what I was really dealing with. Sleep came easier knowing I had her rules to follow, but my dreams were filled with tall figures and missing partners whose faces I'd never seen. 2 days of normal patrols had given me a false sense of security. I'd started to hope that maybe the strange encounters came in waves, that I might get weeks of regular ranger work between incidents. That hope disappeared completely during what should have been a routine morning. Mammoth Hot Springs drew visitors year-round for its terraced limestone formations and steaming pools. The camping area nearby required regular inspection, making sure people followed food storage regulations, checking permits, ensuring nobody was camping too close to the thermal features. Standard stuff that let me focus on the job, instead of looking around every tree line for things that shouldn't exist. I was walking between designated campsites, clipboard in hand, when I spotted them near the northern edge of the camping area. 4 people wearing identical bright yellow rain jackets, standing in a loose cluster near a picnic table. The morning was clear and warm, not a cloud in the sky, which made their choice of outerwear seem odd from the start. But it wasn't the jackets themselves that made my stomach clench. It was how they moved. I stopped beside a large pine tree, pretending to check something on my clipboard while watching them through my peripheral vision. They changed positions like they were connected by invisible strings. When one turned left, they all turned left. When one took a step forward, they all took the same step at exactly the same moment. The timing was perfect in a way that human movement never quite achieved. Their conversation drifted across the campsite, and even from 30 yards away, I could tell something was wrong with it. The words came at regular intervals, like people reading from a script. No natural pauses, no interruptions, no overlapping voices. Each person spoke their lines and waited for the next person to speak theirs. "The weather is very nice today," one of them said. "Yes, it is perfect for hiking," another responded. "We should visit the thermal pools before we leave." "That is a good idea for our group." I'd heard plenty of tourist conversations over the past few days, and none of them sounded like that. People talked over each other, changed subjects mid-sentence, laughed at inappropriate moments. This felt like watching actors who'd never learned how normal human interaction worked. Then they noticed me. All 4 heads turned in my direction at the same time, and I felt their stare like physical pressure against my skin. Their faces were completely ordinary, middle-aged hikers, the kind of people you'd see at any national park. But their eyes held an intensity that made my mouth go dry. They weren't looking at me the way tourists looked at rangers. They were studying me, evaluating me like predators deciding whether I was worth their attention. The 3rd rule blazed through my memory. Avoid anyone wearing yellow rain jackets in groups of 4 or more. Make an excuse and leave the area quickly. I raised my radio to my mouth, keeping my movements casual. "Base, this is Thompson. I've got a priority radio check needed back at the station. I'll be heading in shortly." The radio crackled with static, but I didn't wait for a response. I clicked it back onto my belt and started walking toward the parking area, fighting every instinct that told me to run. The rules had been specific about leaving quickly, but they hadn't said anything about running. Given what I'd learned about the pale figure, I suspected sudden movement might trigger something I didn't want to deal with. The feeling of being watched followed me all the way to my truck. I could feel their eyes tracking my movements, but I didn't look back to confirm it. Whatever those things were wearing yellow jackets, they'd decided I wasn't worth pursuing. The knowledge should have been comforting, but it only raised more questions about what would have happened if I'd approached them directly. I drove away from Mammoth Hot Springs with my hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, trying to process what I'd just seen. 4 entities that looked human, but moved like they shared a single brain, standing in bright sunlight, wearing rain gear for weather that didn't exist, having conversations that sounded like they'd been assembled from a tourist phrase book. My afternoon assignment took me to a remote section of the Grand Loop Road, the main route that connected most of Yellowstone's major attractions. This stretch ran through dense forest with minimal traffic, perfect for checking on backcountry conditions and making sure no one had left trash or illegal campsites along the roadside. I was walking a maintenance trail about half a mile from where I'd parked when I heard it. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling from somewhere deep in the trees to my left. "Help! Please! Somebody help me!" The sound hit me like a physical blow. 7 years of police work had trained me to respond immediately to distress calls, especially when they involved kids. Every protective instinct I'd developed screamed at me to drop everything and run toward that voice. A child was lost, scared, possibly hurt, and I was the only person in the area who could help. "I'm lost. I can't find my mommy and daddy." The voice was heartbreaking, exactly the kind of fear and confusion you'd expect from a young child separated from their parents in the wilderness. It carried clearly through the trees, coming from maybe 100 yards off the trail. Close enough that I could reach them in a few minutes, far enough that they'd never find their way back to the road without help. I took 2 steps toward the tree line before Sarah's 4th rule stopped me cold. Never follow the sound of a child crying, no matter how distressed they sound. Stay on marked trails. The internal war that followed nearly tore me apart. Everything about that voice sounded genuine. The terror, the desperation, the specific way children spoke when they were overwhelmed and frightened. If this was a real kid, and I ignored them because of some paranoid set of rules, I'd never forgive myself. But if Sarah was right, if this was another mimicry designed to lure people away from safety, then following that voice would end with me joining her missing partner. "Please, it's getting dark and I'm scared." I closed my eyes and forced myself to stay on the trail. The voice wasn't coming from a small child lost in the woods. It was coming from something that had learned to copy the sound of human distress, and it was using that knowledge to trick the natural protective instincts that kept people alive in normal circumstances. The crying continued for over an hour as I completed my patrol. Sometimes it seemed to move closer to the trail, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to position itself where I couldn't ignore it. The distress in the voice never got better. If anything, it became more desperate as time passed, adding new details about being hungry and cold, about hearing strange noises in the woods. But I noticed something else that confirmed what I'd suspected. In the direction of that voice, the forest was completely silent. No birds sang in the trees where the crying came from. No insects buzzed in the plants. Even the normal rustling of small animals moving through leaves was missing from that area, as if every living thing with working survival instincts had run away. Whatever was making those sounds, the actual wildlife wanted nothing to do with it. By the time I returned to my truck, the voice had gone quiet in the distance. Whether it had given up on me or moved on to find easier prey, I didn't know. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline finally worked its way out of my system. Following that voice would have felt like the right thing to do, the human thing to do. Instead, I'd stood on a trail and listened to what sounded like a terrified child for over an hour without offering help. The drive back to the ranger station gave me time to think about what Sarah must have gone through. Building her collection of incident reports, learning to recognize patterns that made no logical sense, watching normal protective instincts become liabilities that could get you killed. No wonder she'd quit. The real question was how she'd lasted as long as she did. At the station, I went through the motions of filing my patrol report and updating equipment logs. Normal administrative tasks that felt strange after what I'd experienced. The other rangers worked around me with easy familiarity, discussing visitor complaints and maintenance schedules like this. was any other job in any other place. I waited until most of them had finished their paperwork and headed home. The station grew quiet as evening came, leaving me alone with filing cabinets full of official documentation that probably didn't mention anything really important. Sarah's incident reports had been hidden in her desk drawer, personal notes that never made it into permanent records. If she'd left behind anything else, it wouldn't be somewhere obvious. The training manuals filled an entire shelf near the back of the station. Basic ranger procedures, wildlife management protocols, emergency response guidelines, the kind of reference materials that built up in any workplace. Most of them looked like they hadn't been touched in years, thick binders covered with dust and organized by topics that rarely came up in day-to-day operations. I pulled down a manual labeled Backcountry Safety Procedures and flipped through pages of standard warnings about bears, weather hazards, and medical emergencies. Nothing unusual until I reached the section on radio protocols. There, tucked between pages discussing communication procedures, were several sheets of paper covered with Sarah's careful handwriting. These notes were different from the incident reports I'd found in her desk, more detailed, more personal, and significantly more disturbing. The voices are getting better at copying specific people. Yesterday, I heard Mark calling for help near Shoshone Lake, but Mark was at the visitor center giving guided tours all afternoon. When I investigated, I found footprints that started human and gradually became something else, longer, with too many joints in the foot. The crying child phenomenon appears most frequently near thermal features and along remote sections of the Grand Loop Road. I've tested this by playing recordings of actual children in distress, and the local wildlife reacts completely differently. When real children cry, birds become agitated and animals move toward the sound to investigate. When the fake crying starts, everything goes silent and leaves the area. I think I understand what happened to David now. 3 weeks ago, he followed what he thought was a lost girl into the woods near Artist Point. The search team found his radio and badge scattered along a game trail, but no other trace. What they didn't find, what I didn't report, was the thing wearing his face and uniform that tried to get me to come closer. It knew his name, his assignment, details about our relationship that no one else would have known. But it couldn't quite get his voice right. Too much emphasis on the wrong syllables, like something trying to speak English as a second language. The papers included sketches that made my skin crawl, footprint progressions showing human tracks gradually getting longer and developing additional toe joints, diagrams of thermal areas where the crying phenomenon happened most frequently, maps marking locations where rangers and visitors had gone missing over the past 5 years, with notes about false distress calls reported in those areas. The final page was a letter that she'd never intended to send. To whoever reads this, I can't stay here anymore. David is gone, and I know what took him. But I can't prove it, and no one would believe me anyway. The things in this park have learned to use our protective instincts against us. They copy the voices and appearances of people in distress, and when we respond the way we're trained to respond, we disappear. The rules I left in Locker 37 will keep you alive if you follow them exactly. Don't try to be a hero. Don't trust anything that seems wrong, even if it looks recognizable. The entities here are patient and intelligent, and they're studying us as much as we're trying to understand them. I've documented everything I can, but I'm not strong enough to stay and fight something I don't understand. Maybe you'll be different. Maybe you'll find a way to stop them. But if you can't, at least you'll survive long enough to warn whoever comes after you. Sarah Mitchell. I read through her notes twice, feeling pieces of a larger picture fall into place. The yellow-jacketed hikers moving in perfect synchronization. The child's voice that made wildlife run instead of investigate. The pale figure with long limbs that had watched me but hadn't come closer when I followed the rules. Sarah had spent months documenting an intelligence that studied human behavior and used that knowledge to hunt. something that could copy voices, appearances, and behaviors well enough to fool people who should have known better. Her partner David had been lured away by something wearing a child's appearance, and later she'd encountered that same entity wearing his face and uniform. I gathered Sarah's hidden notes and slipped them into my jacket alongside the incident reports. Whatever was happening in Yellowstone, it was bigger and more organized than random supernatural encounters. These things were learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated in their hunting methods. But Sarah had also figured out how to survive them. The rules worked because they went against human nature, because they required you to ignore instincts that had kept people alive for thousands of years. Following them felt wrong, but they'd kept me safe through encounters that had ended badly for others. As I locked up the station and headed to my cabin, I understood that Sarah hadn't just left behind warnings. She'd left behind a responsibility. Someone needed to keep documenting these encounters, keep updating the rules, keep protecting the people who came to Yellowstone expecting normal wilderness dangers. The question was whether I was strong enough to stay when she hadn't been, whether I could build on her work instead of just following her footsteps out of the park. Time would tell, but tonight I'd survived 2 more encounters with things that shouldn't exist. That felt like progress, even if I didn't know where it was leading. I settled into my narrow cabin bunk that night, with Sarah's letter and notes spread across the small table beside me. Knowing all this made sleep feel impossible, but exhaustion from the day's encounters eventually pulled me under. The knocking started at 11:47 p.m. 3 sharp raps against my cabin door yanked me from deep sleep. I checked the digital clock beside my bed, the red numbers glowing in the darkness. My first instinct was to roll out of bed and answer. Police training had conditioned me to respond immediately to any sign of emergency. Mike Thompson, you in there?" The voice outside sounded familiar. James Rodriguez, another ranger I'd met during my first week. His tone carried the specific urgency that came with real crisis situations, not panic, but the controlled desperation of someone trying to manage a dangerous situation while staying professional. "We've got a family lost near the thermal features," James called through the door. "Parents and 2 young kids been missing for 3 hours. I need backup for the search." Every protective instinct I'd developed over 7 years of police work screamed at me to get dressed and help. Lost children in wilderness areas represented exactly the kind of emergency that required immediate response. Time mattered. Body temperature dropped quickly in mountain air, and young kids could develop hypothermia within hours of exposure. But the 5th rule blazed through my memory with perfect clarity. Do not answer doors after 11 p.m., regardless of who claims to be outside. I stayed in bed, fighting against every trained response that told me to move. The voice outside belonged to James Rodriguez. I recognized the slight accent, the particular way he emphasized certain syllables. Nothing about it sounded fake or wrong. This wasn't the obviously mechanical speech pattern I'd heard from the yellow-jacketed hikers, or the too perfect distress calls from the crying child phenomenon. "Mike, I know you're in there. Your truck's outside." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Look, I understand you're new, but we don't have time for hesitation here. These kids have been missing since 8:30. The details felt real. Search rules required calling all available people during child danger situations. James would naturally think I was asleep and need to wake me up. The timeline he'd given made sense for organizing a search effort. Everything about the situation lined up with real emergency procedures. I pressed my face into the pillow and forced myself to remember Sarah's incident reports. The entities here had learned to copy specific people, using details about relationships and procedures that they couldn't possibly know. She'd met something wearing her missing partner's face and uniform, speaking with enough accuracy to fool someone who'd worked with him for months. "The parents are hysterical," the voice continued. "Little girl, maybe 6 years old, and a boy who can't be more than 4. They wandered off from their campsite while the parents were setting up dinner. We've got thermal imaging coming. But you know how fast conditions change out there. 20 minutes passed with steady knocking and increasingly desperate explanations. The voice gave specific details about the search grid, mentioned other rangers by name, described the family's camping setup with the kind of accuracy that came from direct observation. If this was copying, it was perfect. But I stayed in bed. Around 12:15, something changed. The voice had been staying perfectly consistent for over 20 minutes, but suddenly it got slightly higher in pitch. Not dramatically, just enough that my ear caught the difference. Like someone adjusting a radio frequency and overshooting the correct setting. "Mike, what's wrong with you?" The words came out too sharp, too high. "There are children out there who need help." A few minutes later, the pitch dropped too low, becoming a bass rumble that no human throat could produce naturally. The accent disappeared entirely, replaced by careful enunciation that sounded like someone reading phonetically from a script. "Open this door immediately. You are required to assist in emergency situations." The knocking changed too. What had started as normal human tapping became something mechanical and never-ending. Steady hits that shook the entire cabin frame, delivered with inhuman consistency. No change in timing or force, just the same measured blow every 2 seconds. I pulled my pillow over my head, but the sound came through the fabric. The thing outside was hitting my door with enough force to make the windows shake, keeping that perfect rhythm without any sign of getting tired or frustrated. No human could keep up that kind of physical effort for 20 minutes without change. The voice continued getting worse, cycling between pitches that ranged from childlike squeaking to sounds that seemed to come from something with a much larger chest than any person had. But it kept using James Rodriguez's speech patterns, his vocabulary, his knowledge of search procedures. At exactly midnight, everything stopped. The knocking stopped mid-strike. The voice cut off in the middle of a sentence about helicopter support. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and the distant settling sounds of the cabin's wooden frame. I waited another hour before getting out of bed to check the windows. Nothing moved outside. No footprints in the dirt around my cabin. No signs that anyone or anything had been there. Even the area directly in front of my door looked undisturbed, though 20 minutes of violent impacts had shaken my walls. The next morning, I called James Rodriguez from the ranger station. He answered on the second ring, sounding groggy but alert. "Mike, everything okay? Just checking on something. Were you working late last night? Any search and rescue operations?" "Nah, I was home all evening. Had dinner with my girlfriend and watched a movie." "Why?" "Thought I heard something on the radio about a lost family. Must have been another district. Not that I heard about. I would have gotten called if there was anything major going down." James paused, probably wondering why I was asking. "You sure you're okay? You sound tired." "Long night. Thanks for checking." I hung up before he could ask more questions. James lived 40 miles away in a different town, far enough that even if he'd wanted to help with an emergency, he wouldn't have driven to my cabin to get me personally. The search coordination would have gone through the main station, with radio contact and official protocols. Whatever had been outside my cabin had known enough about James to copy his voice and mannerisms perfectly, but it hadn't understood the practical logistics of how rangers actually responded to emergencies. It had created a scenario that sounded convincing but fell apart under basic scrutiny. I spent the morning going through more of Sarah's personal effects. Items that had been boxed up and stored in the station's back office when she quit. Most of it was standard ranger gear and administrative paperwork. But tucked inside a field guide to Yellowstone geology, I found what appeared to be her final report. The handwriting was shakier than her other notes, written in obvious haste or emotional distress. I broke the rules. I followed the crying child. Yesterday evening, near Norris Geyser Basin, I heard a little girl calling for help from the woods. I knew better. I had written the rules myself, documented dozens of false distress calls, understood exactly what these entities were capable of. But the voice was so perfect. so heartbreaking, and I convinced myself that this time might be different. I followed the sound for nearly a mile into unmarked territory. The crying stayed ahead of me, always just out of sight, leading me deeper into areas where the thermal activity made the ground unstable and dangerous. When I finally caught up to the source, I found David. Not David. Something wearing his face in uniform, crouched beside a steaming mud pot and making the sounds of a crying child. It looked exactly like him. Same height, same build, same facial expressions I had seen thousands of times over 2 years of working together. But when it spoke to me, trying to continue the crying child act, the voice came out wrong. Too high, like air being forced through a smaller throat than the body should have contained. "Help me, Sarah. I'm lost and scared." The thing wearing David's face couldn't keep the child's voice while looking at me directly. It kept switching between his normal speech and the crying sounds, creating a horrible combination that made my stomach turn. When it realized the trick had failed, it stood up and started walking toward me with movements that were almost but not quite human. Too smooth, like joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. I ran, broke every rule about not making sudden movements, not showing fear, not turning my back on the entities. I ran through thermal fields and over unstable ground, expecting at any moment to feel inhuman hands grabbing at my back, or to hear David's voice calling my name from something that had never been human. I made it back to my truck, but I could feel it following me at a distance, testing my speed, my endurance, learning how humans moved when they were scared. It didn't try to catch me. It was studying me. I can't stay here anymore. I can't look at David's desk, his equipment, his duty assignments, knowing that something is out there wearing his face and learning to be more convincing. The next ranger who sees that thing might not realize what it is until it's too late. The rules work. They kept me alive even when I was stupid enough to break them. Follow them exactly, and don't make my mistake. Don't convince yourself that this time will be different. It won't be. I read Sarah's account 3 times, my hands shaking slightly by the end. She'd quit, not just because her partner was missing, but because she'd seen him after he was gone. The entities weren't just copying random people. They were taking the appearance of specific individuals, learning their mannerisms and relationships, becoming more sophisticated hunters. The thing outside my cabin last night had been using James Rodriguez's voice, using his knowledge and speech patterns to create a convincing emergency scenario. If I'd opened that door, I would have faced something that looked and sounded like a colleague I trusted, right up until the moment it showed what it really was. Sarah had given me more than rules for survival. She'd shown me the cost of breaking them, the particular horror of seeing known faces twisted into hunting tools. Her final report wasn't just documentation. It was a warning about the psychological warfare these entities engaged in, using our connections to other people as weapons against us. I folded Sarah's final report and placed it with the rest of her documentation. Tomorrow night, I'd be back on patrol, and eventually, something would test my resolve again. But now I understood what I was really protecting myself from. Not just physical danger, but the emotional devastation of watching friends and colleagues become hunting masks for things that had never been human. The rules weren't just about staying alive. They were about staying sane while surrounded by predators intelligent enough to turn love and loyalty into fatal weaknesses. 7 nights into my new life as a Yellowstone ranger, I'd started to believe I understood the rhythm of supernatural encounters. Each phenomenon had appeared individually. The pale figure, the unnatural silence, the yellow-jacketed hikers, the crying child, the midnight knocking. I'd followed Sarah's rules precisely, and they'd kept me alive through situations that had claimed her partner and driven her away. The confidence felt dangerous now, like assuming you could predict the weather based on a handful of clear days. The previous 3 nights had been completely normal. Standard patrols with routine camper interactions, radio check-ins that involved actual rangers, wildlife behavior that made sense. I'd almost convinced myself that whatever controlled these entities operated on some kind of schedule, giving people breathing room between tests. That assumption shattered completely on my 7th night. My patrol route took me through the Norris Geyser Basin area, the same region where Sarah had made her final mistake and followed the crying child to find something wearing her missing partner's face. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked the same trails where she'd broken her own rules and discovered the true horror of what these things were capable of becoming. The forest fell silent at 9:23 p.m. I stopped mid-step with my right foot raised, exactly as I'd done near Lamar Valley. But this silence felt different, heavier, more loaded with potential. The normal sounds of insects, settling trees, and distant thermal activity vanished so completely that I could hear my own breathing and the fabric of my uniform rustling with each heartbeat. Then I saw it. The pale figure stood between two lodgepole pines, approximately 40 yards to my left, exactly where my peripheral vision could just catch its outline, tall and wrong, with proportions that suggested human anatomy stretched by something that didn't understand how bodies actually worked. But this time, it didn't remain stationary. Keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead, I watched through the edge of my vision as the figure began to move. Not walking, sliding between trees with a fluid motion that ignored the uneven terrain and thick brush. It was circling me, staying at the exact distance where I could just barely see its movement without looking directly at it. My leg muscles burned from maintaining the frozen position, but I didn't dare change my weight or lower my raised foot. The pale figure completed one full circle around my position, then another, moving with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Each circuit brought it slightly closer, testing the boundaries of how near it could approach while I followed the rules exactly. After what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes, the forest sounds rushed back like someone had unmuted the world. Birds called from branches, insects resumed their chirping, and the distant bubbling of thermal features filled the air with normal background noise. My foot touched the ground and I nearly stumbled as blood flow returned to muscles that had been locked in place. The pale figure was gone. I continued my patrol with shaking hands, trying to process what had just happened. The entity hadn't given up after a few minutes like before. It had tested my endurance, my commitment to following the rules even when my body screamed for relief. The circling behavior suggested intelligence and planning, not random supernatural encounters, but deliberate psychological warfare. 20 minutes later, I spotted them near the Porcelain Basin overlook. 4 figures in bright yellow rain jackets stood in a perfect square formation around a park information sign. Even from a distance, their movements looked wrong, too synchronized, too fluid, like marionettes controlled by someone who'd studied human motion but never quite mastered it. But this time, they weren't having stilted conversations or pretending to be tourists. They were walking in formation. All 4 moved in exactly the same direction at exactly the same pace, their feet hitting the ground in perfect unison. When they turned as one unit, like a military drill team performing a complex routine. But their gaits were wrong, steps too long, joints bending at angles that human anatomy couldn't accommodate, feet touching down with no variation in timing or force. The sound of their footsteps carried across the basin like a drumbeat. 4 sets of boots striking pavement in mechanical precision, creating a rhythm that felt hypnotic and deeply unsettling. No conversation, no tourist behavior, just 4 things wearing human bodies and yellow jackets moving through the park like they owned it. I raised my radio and called in another fake priority check, backing away from the area as quickly as I could without actually running. The rule said to make an excuse and leave quickly, but it also warned against sudden movements that might trigger pursuit. I had to balance speed with the appearance of casual retreat, hoping these things would decide I wasn't worth their attention. Behind me, The footsteps continued their perfect rhythm for several more minutes before fading into silence. Whatever those entities were, they'd let me go again. But the feeling of being evaluated, tested, remained stronger than ever. The crying started as I reached the parking area near the Norris campground. Not one child's voice like I'd heard before, but multiple children calling from different directions in the woods, a little girl sobbing from the north, a boy screaming for his parents from the east, twins or siblings calling each other's names from the south and west. The voices overlapped and bounced off trees, creating a cacophony of false distress that made my chest tight with suppressed protective instincts. Mommy, Daddy, where are you? I'm scared. Something's following me. Help! I fell and hurt my leg. Sarah! Sarah! Where did you go? Each voice carried perfect emotional truth, the specific terror and confusion of children lost in wilderness areas, but the coordination was impossible. Real lost children wouldn't all end up in different parts of the same forest at the same time, all crying with identical worry, all using the same phrases that were designed to trigger adult protective responses. The wildlife had left completely. No insects buzzed in the bushes, no birds called from the trees, no small animals moved through leaves. Even the normal sounds of nighttime creatures had vanished, leaving only the fake chorus of crying children that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I forced myself to walk to my truck and drive away, leaving behind what sounded like a dozen terrified kids who needed immediate help. The voices followed me down the road for nearly a mile, staying just loud enough to hear through my closed windows, making sure I couldn't ignore what sounded like a massive child endangerment emergency. By the time I reached my cabin, my hands were shaking from the effort of not responding to what every instinct told me was a crisis requiring immediate action. But I'd learned to trust Sarah's rules over my training, to accept that these things understood human psychology well enough to use our protective instincts against us. The attack began at 11:15 p.m. The first knock came from my front door. 3 sharp raps followed by David Wilson's voice calling my name. He needed help with a vehicle accident near the main road, tourists injured and requiring immediate medical assistance. When I didn't respond, the knocking moved to my bedroom window. James Rodriguez this time, reporting a building fire at the visitor center. Then more voices joined in. Dr. Peterson, the park naturalist I'd met during orientation, knocked on my back door and called through the wall about a bear attack near Old Faithful. A camper from Minnesota, the same family I'd checked permits for, tapped on my kitchen window and begged for help finding their missing daughter. Other tourists whose names I'd never learned knocked on every surface of my small cabin, each reporting different emergencies that required my immediate response. The knocking came from all sides now. Doors, windows, even the roof above my bed. Dozens of voices I recognized from my week at Yellowstone, all claiming crisis situations that demanded breaking the 5th rule. The sound was constant, overlapping, creating a wall of noise that made thinking clearly almost impossible. But as the hours passed, the voices began to break down. David Wilson's measured authority turned into something too deep and rich for his actual throat. James Rodriguez's accent disappeared and reappeared randomly, sometimes mid-sentence. The tourists started using words and phrases they'd never spoken when I'd met them, as if the entities were making up dialogue based on incomplete understanding of human speech patterns. Around 2 a.m., the voices gave up any pretense of accuracy. They cycled through every person I'd encountered, but the pitch and tone kept changing wildly. Sometimes David's voice came from something that was clearly much smaller than his actual body size. Sometimes James sounded like he was speaking from the bottom of a well, or through vocal cords that weren't quite the right shape. The knocking never stopped. My cabin shook under the constant impacts from every direction. Windows rattled in their frames, dishes clinked on shelves, and the entire structure groaned under attack from things that could maintain perfect rhythm for hours without showing fatigue. But nothing tried to break in. They just knocked and called and demanded entry using voices of people I trusted and emergencies designed to override my caution. I stayed in bed with Sarah's rules clutched in my hand, counting minutes and fighting the urge to help people who weren't really there. 7 hours of psychological warfare designed to break down my resistance and force me to open a door that would probably be the last mistake I ever made. At exactly dawn, everything stopped. The knocking stopped mid-strike. The voices cut off without finishing their sentences. The silence that followed was so complete that my ears rang from the sudden absence of noise. I waited another hour before checking the windows and found no evidence that anything had been outside. No footprints, no damaged surfaces, no signs of the attack that had shaken my cabin all night. I sat at my small table with Sarah's documentation spread out before me, finally understanding what she'd been trying to tell me. The rules weren't just survival instructions, they were a test. These entities were intelligent enough to coordinate complex attacks, patient enough to spend hours wearing down human resistance, and smart enough to study our behavior and adapt their hunting methods accordingly. But they were also bound by limitations. They couldn't break the rules any more than I could afford to break them. Whatever prevented them from approaching when I avoided looking directly, whatever stopped them from entering my cabin uninvited, whatever kept them from pursuing when I followed the correct protocols, those boundaries were real and consistent. Sarah had discovered how to survive in a park where supernatural predators studied human nature and used that knowledge to hunt. She'd documented their methods, learned their limitations, and created a framework that could keep people alive if they had the discipline to follow it exactly. But she'd also left something else, a responsibility. I picked up a pen and started writing my own notes on a fresh piece of paper. The coordinated nature of the seventh night attack, the way the entities tested boundaries and checked responses, the progression from individual encounters to complex psychological warfare. Information that the next ranger would need to understand what they were really dealing with. Because there would be a next ranger. People quit jobs in national parks all the time, and eventually someone else would inherit Locker 37 and find Sarah's rules taped to the inside door. They'd go through the same process of doubt, testing, and gradual acceptance that I had, but they'd also inherit my additions to Sarah's work. More detailed documentation, better understanding of the entity's capabilities, improved strategies for surviving encounters. I thought about the pale figure circling me in the darkness, the yellow-jacketed hikers moving with inhuman precision, the crying children that made wildlife flee, the voices of trusted colleagues demanding entry to my cabin. These things weren't random supernatural occurrences. They were evidence of an intelligence that studied human behavior and used that knowledge to eliminate threats to whatever they were protecting or claiming as territory. Sarah had figured out how to survive them, but she'd been one person fighting a war she couldn't win. She'd lost her partner, broken her own rules in grief, and left rather than continue facing entities that wore faces to hunt her. But she'd also left behind everything I needed to do better than she had. I spent the morning updating Sarah's documentation with my own notes, refining the rules based on what I'd learned about the entity's limitations and testing methods. The fifth rule needed expansion. They would use every voice you recognized, not just rangers and officials. The second rule required clarification about duration. The silence could last much longer when they were conducting coordinated tests. By afternoon, I'd created a comprehensive guide that built on Sarah's foundation, while adding crucial details about the escalation patterns and psychological warfare tactics. The next ranger wouldn't face these things blind or unprepared. They'd have the benefit of both Sarah's tragic experience and my successful adaptation to her methods. That evening, I contacted Park Administration and submitted my request for a permanent position transfer to the Night Patrol Division. When they asked why I wanted to specialize in after-hours duties, I told them I'd found the work suited my background and temperament. I didn't mention the real reason. that someone needed to stand guard between the supernatural dangers and the innocent visitors who came to Yellowstone expecting normal wilderness hazards. 7 nights had taught me that these entities were patient, intelligent, and utterly committed to testing anyone who showed signs of understanding their existence. But they were also limited by rules as rigid as the ones Sarah had left for me. They could mimic human appearance and behavior, but they couldn't break certain boundaries without invitation or direct engagement. I could work within those limits. I could follow the rules exactly while documenting everything, building a more complete understanding of what these things were and how they operated. Maybe I'd never find a way to stop them, but I could definitely protect the people who came after me. As the sun set behind the mountains and my 8th night began, I felt something I hadn't expected. Purpose. Sarah had run because she'd been alone and overwhelmed, but I wasn't starting from scratch. I had her foundation, her documentation, her hard-won knowledge of how to survive. More importantly, I had the chance to make sure the next ranger who inherited this responsibility wouldn't face it alone either. The entities could test, hunt, and mimic all they wanted. As long as someone followed the rules and kept adding to the documentation, their advantages would gradually diminish. I locked the expanded rules in my desk drawer and prepared for patrol, carrying Sarah's original note in my pocket like a talisman. 7 nights had shown me the true nature of my job. Tonight, I'd start learning how to do it even better.